there? Yeah. My name is Alyssa Ayers, and I'm Dean of the Elliott School of International Affairs at the George Washington University. And so welcome to all of you here. This, as I hope everybody in the room is aware, is the 8th edition of the World Bank, George Washington University International Growth Center Conference on Urbanization and Poverty Reduction Research. And it's become one of the most important conferences that links academics, policymakers, and students, importantly, in the Washington, D.C. area, as well as policymakers from Africa, Asia, and Latin America. And so we at the Elliott School are just thrilled to be part of this collaboration through Professor Remy Jedwab's leadership, because we're focused on advancing practical, policy-relevant ideas, and this conversation is focused on policy-relevant ideas on urbanization and poverty reduction. Previous themes of this conference have included people, markets, and cities, climate change and sustainable urbanization, and building or rebuilding cities for growth. And this year's theme is urban expansion and the future of cities, which is a huge priority for global affairs generally, and for us at the Elliott School of International Affairs, for our Institute for International Economic Policy, and for the George Washington University community, given our interest in subnational governance and sustainability. Now today, as you can see, we're going to hear from outstanding policymakers and scholars who are deeply focused on these questions. We'll hear from 3 policymakers who have made and are making globally noteworthy contributions on planning in African cities. A common thread of their success is how they managed public finance and coordinated expectations across different stakeholders to deliver public services at various spatial scales. We'll hear about how transport projects spanning jurisdictional boundaries can be coordinated and effectively financed, how urban planning can guide citizens and governments in coordinated action toward collective goals, and how donor finance can be effectively used to improve institutions for large metropolitan areas across multiple jurisdictional bodies. Following our 3 panelists, our 3 policy keynotes, we will hear reflections from 2 top academics, followed by an open group discussion. I'd like to just add a note here about the Elliott School and why we care about urbanization and its importance for the international affairs field. Now, the experts in this room, we're here at the World Bank, you're all well aware of the world's rapid urbanization and the need for countries still urbanizing to get these processes right, quote unquote, in terms of becoming spaces that support and enhance their citizens' lives, human flourishing. The city has triumphed, to invoke Professor Glaser's work, and for many developing economies, there are huge pressures to deliver infrastructure and services to citizens at massive scale. And this is all taking place against that backdrop of climate change, of changing future of work, of a multilateral global landscape of increasing city-to-city engagement and increasing donor and financial institution engagement with municipal level leaders. So today's conversation highlights the growing need and desire for cities and subnational actors to be both at the table and working in parallel with and complementing the actions of national governments. I also just want to say quickly that it's great to see GW students in the room. We had close to 100 students sign up for today's various conversations, and this is an incredible experience. It's one of the hallmarks of an education at the Elliott School and the George Washington University, the opportunity to be part of live policy discussions like this in the room with policymakers. So we're so grateful for the opportunity to let our students be part of today. A last housekeeping note before I go ahead and introduce our panelists. From 5:30 to 7:30 p.m. this evening, the Elliott School will host a cocktail reception in room 602 of our building. We're a couple blocks away down on E Street between 19th and 20th, 1957 E Street. We welcome you all to join, and details of how to get there. It's not that far, you just walk down the street and turn right or left, depending on which street you take, but details of how to get there from the World Bank are all provided on the website for this conference. Now I'm going to go ahead and introduce our speakers. We are very excited for today's discussion. To my immediate left is Mayor Yvonne Aki-Sawyer, who is Mayor of Freetown, Sierra Leone, and also the co-chair of the C40. She is a finance professional with over 25 years of experience in strategic planning, risk management, and project management in the public and private sectors. She is passionate about the development of Sierra Leone and is a chartered accountant holding an MSc in politics of the world economy from London School of Economics and a BSc with honors in economics from Fora Bay College. To her left is Charles Hinga, who is Principal Secretary of the State Department for Housing and Urban Development in Kenya. He is a chartered accountant and holds a Bachelor of Commerce in Accounting degree from Kenyatta University and a Bachelor of Accounting Sciences with honors from the University of South Africa. He has worked in South Africa, where he participated actively in implementation of infrastructure projects in urban areas via public-private partnerships. To his left, we have Mohamed Damba, Head of Policy Planning and Evaluation in the Office of the President, Zongo and Intercities Development Secretariat, and the Office of the President in Ghana. He is an urban planner with vast experience in urban land use and spatial planning. He has worked at the Ghana Institute of Planners. He holds a master's degree in development planning and management and a bachelor's degree in planning. He has interests in research, crop farming, appropriate technology experimentation, and community services in environmental sanitation. He has studied and worked in Ghana, the United States, Japan, China, Denmark, Brazil, South Korea, and Malaysia. The panelist presentations will be followed by responses from our two scholarly respondents. We first will have Professor Ed Glazer, who is the Fred and Eleanor Glimp Professor of Economics and the Chairman of the Department of Economics at Harvard University. He is also Research Program Director for the IGC's Cities Research Program. He studies the economics of cities and has written papers on urban issues, including the growth of cities, segregation, crime, and housing markets. He received his BA in economics from Princeton University and his PhD from the University of Chicago. And of inspiration, particularly for this conversation, in 2011, he published a book, Triumph of the City: How Our Greatest Invention Makes Us Richer, Smarter, Greener, Healthier, and Happier, which was shortlisted for the Financial Times and Goldman Sachs Business Book of the Year Award. And, oh, pardon? Okay, and then finally, our second respondent will be Professor Shlomi Soli Angel, who is Professor of City Planning at the Marin Institute of NYU. He leads NYU's urban expansion program. He is an international expert on housing and urban development policy, having written extensively on the subject. He has advised the United Nations, the World Bank, and the Inter-American Development Bank, and implemented projects on the ground. He currently focuses on documenting urban expansion and densification in a global sample of cities, as well as on advising rapidly growing cities on how to prepare adequate room for their inevitable expansion while making adequate room for the densification of their existing footprints. So we have a wonderful set of speakers and respondents today. Let's go ahead and get started. Let's turn to Mayor Aki Sawyer. Over to you for your policy keynote.
Thank you.
Would you like to speak from there? Okay.
Thank you very much. So I think the title of my submission is a bit of a hint. Urban Planning Without Urban Planning Tools, Freetown, a Case Study. So let's see if I can get this thing to work. Is it the one with the red? Right. Okay, so the background. I kind of alluded to this when we were speaking earlier about urban growth and the fact that population growth has been a feature in Freetown. As a city, our population has grown 10 times in the past 50 years, a period of time that is very different. And on average, a European city would have needed 150 years to grow 10 times in size. Annual growth is about 4% now. And as I mentioned, we're expecting that rural-urban migration to be increasingly fueled by climate change and leading to a city, currently about 1.2 million, to be about 2 million by 2028. So, urban planning without planning tools. This is a conference about urbanization with a focus on planning. But what happens when you don't have planning tools? The Local Government Act of 2004 set out within it devolved functions which included land use planning and building permit. 10 years later, an EU-funded project, the Freetown Structure Plan, developed a planning model, created 12 planning zones for the city. But in all of that time, the function of land use planning and building permit was not devolved. Fast forward 2019, we see a statement by the government that they're going to devolve planning, and then it's retracted within 24 hours. 2022, there's a new act that again devolves land use planning but becomes silent on building permit. And here we are in 2024. And there's a World Bank project now which is looking at land use, land administration, structure plans, but the irony remains that the land use planning has not been devolved. There are attempts which we are making now, to that point about collaboration, for the city to work with the Ministry of Local Government, Ministry of Lands, on small area action plans, but these are small in just a number of settlements. I really want to underscore this point, because when we talk about policy, when we talk about research, when we talk about making progress and moving the dial on poverty, it is impossible for us to really, truly, sincerely do this without addressing contextual problems such as this one. What are the consequences of not having land use planning, of not having a building control regime? It is what you see. We have 82 informal settlements in the city now. I've given you a spatial image of just one, the Cockle Bay community. And you can see May 2015, January 2020, June 2022. Literally, the community is growing into the ocean. And that is being done by banking using waste. So the implications for ocean pollution, the implication for the beaches being polluted as garbage washes back are massive. But also, in the absence of building control, you have hazardous buildings, you have deforestation. We've lost 26% of forest cover since 2016, and you have constant flooding and risk of landslides. So I think the question was asked by USID about what I meant, and I said I would explain. This is what I mean, that if you have to plan a city and you haven't got the most important elements or tools to plan the city, what do you do? What we did was to take a comprehensive and holistic approach, which sought to address the consequences of that lack of planning, address the challenges of city growth by doing so, and in doing so, to look at it from an inclusive perspective, so very much having community at the heart, to have innovation, we talked about that earlier on, to have data, and clearly to have technology, which comes with the innovation and the data. Transform Freetown is what our plan was called. It's still called #Transform Freetown. It has 4 clusters: resilience, human development, healthy city, and urban mobility. And within those 4 clusters are 11 priority sectors. I'm going to respect time, so I'm not going to go into this in great detail, but you can see that it ranges from environmental protection through to sanitation, right down to persons with disability and urban mobility. And very importantly, in the question that was posed to us as we prepared for this submission, is the who. How do you coordinate? And for us, it was by bringing all actors together. And we started with community. So in this slide, we show the fact that in around July to September 2018, at the start of my first term, we engaged 15,000 residents. And in doing so, we brought to them the skeleton of those areas of focus. And we asked for their input in terms of affordability, accessibility, and availability of service delivery. And we weren't surprised at the results, but it really gave us the basis for community voice to then be matched or put in with technical work. And I think we challenged the way in which development plans had been done at the local level before, where it was very much bottom up. I came and took the view that for us to move our city forward, we didn't just need to hear from community participants, we also needed to hear from technicians. We needed to go along those 11 priority sectors and ask ministries, departments, and agencies, development partners, NGOs, CBOs, the private sector. We had to bring them together, and this is really, really important from a policy perspective, to prevent silo working, to prevent everybody going off and doing what they want to do from a World Bank perspective, what they want to do from an EU perspective, what goal or CRS want to do as an NGO. We brought everyone to one table and said, this is where we're going as the city, but let's co-create together. So we had a series of planning labs, identified what the problem statements were, brought in research, and eventually came out with a theory of change and specific interventions. And Transform Freetown was launched on the 24th of January, 2019. These are our 19 targets, and we articulated for each of the sectors 1 or 2 numerical targets, which as a politician is kind of frightening because you're telling your city, this is what I'm going to do, and they can track you. But the good thing about it, I'll quickly gloss over the fact that, of course, it was aligned to the SDGs, all good plans are, also aligned to the national development plans of the central government, but importantly, coming back to this business about holding one's feet to the fire. And earlier on, when we talked about technology, mention was made of social media. This is very, very important in moving the city along. So the Transform Freetown is not the city's plan, as in the city councils, but the city's plan, as in the residents. So we're very active on reporting and annually produce a report for city residents, which is online, which is in hard copy, which actually shows them where we are against our targets. A couple of examples, conscious of time, so I'm not going to go into this, but Freetown, the Tree Town, the planting and tracking of the 1 million trees. As I said earlier on, we're on 977,000. By June, we'll be at 1 million. And now we've set ourselves a target of 5 million by 2028. This is another example of innovation and thinking outside the box in addressing our liquid waste management challenges and building a circular economy by introducing a geobag wastewater treatment plant, which is now enabling us to produce compost, briquettes for coal as an alternative to wood burning, as well as biogas for cooking. Money matters. And at the heart of everything, I mentioned before that the system of digitizing our property rate. This is a bit more information on how that's done and how that was done. But what I think I really wanted to point out is that as I said before, it was a catalyst for so much more innovation and intervention. Transform Freetown, 19 targets. For those of you who may receive a copy of the slide, this is just to show a number of the other interventions. The introduction of a climate action plan is really significant, but so is also the fact that we are 2/3 of the way into a 2-year feasibility study to introduce a cable car system as the city's first ever mass transit system. This will speak to the economic productivities questions we talked about, the connectivity for hard to reach areas, and so on. Again, not enough time to go into this in detail. I just wanted to give a flavor of the sorts of innovations that are possible and interventions, but very importantly, and I mentioned it on the slide where I showed the 19 targets, the implementation is driven by, and the achievement of the targets is driven by Freetown City Council, but the financing and the implementation of the interventions to get to our targets are done through multiple sources. So this is where collaboration really is key. And it's particularly key because I was in Cape Town just a few weeks ago and got budget envy. I was with 14 other mayors and governors, and I've provided you with a snapshot of what other cities have as budget per resident. I will start with Windhoek, who has $879 per resident, and I will jump to Freetown, where it's $2.53 per resident. So the importance of co-funding is critical, but here also is another message. We were able to increase our revenue potential 5-fold. However, our currency depreciation eroded all of those gains. So as we come into this administration, I'm very conscious as a city leader that urban planning is not just about the spatial planning, but it's also about planning for growth. So Transform Freetown in the development plan for 2024 to 2028 has become Transform Freetown, Transforming Lives, with a big focus on growing the economy and creating jobs. We've set ourselves a target. It's yet to be confirmed, so you're getting a peep. So don't hold me to this yet. We've not confirmed it, but we're aiming for 120,000 green, dignified jobs for women and youth by 2028. And to do that, again, we have 4 clusters, but this time it's climate action, bringing all our climate work into one space. It's heritage tourism, capitalizing on the beauty of our city. It's the digital economy, the point about technology, and then it's human development, the training and the skills that are required to underpin all of this. And as before, it can only be done through the collaboration of others, which means we're bringing private finance, we're bringing grant finance, philanthropy, city revenue increasing, as well as government support where that's possible. And I will just conclude by saying, as we move forward, we've already begun to see where the bulk of those jobs could come from. This is city planning when you don't have planning tools, but you're able to look across sectors and address the challenges of your residents. And ultimately, what success will look like is multi-generational wealth creation, which means the definition of a job is not a 3-week job, it's a real job. Transformed lives and livelihoods, increased provision of basic services, and importantly, Freetown known as a destination city. This is my city. Transforms Freetown, transforming lives, intends to make Freetown not just a city with a view, but a city with a view enjoyed by all its residents. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and I think that's a very tough act to follow. That was very well done. Planning in African cities. It's a very broad topic, and my background, I'm a chartered accountant, but I used to be a preacher when I was in high school. And so when you have such a broad topic, one can tend to be a bit indisciplined. So I'll try within the time given, and I want to put my stopwatch to try and contextualize. So when you talk about planning in African cities, it's important to understand who are you planning for? And I think there's no cookie cutter type of solution. So I'm going to talk about Nairobi and Nairobi metropolitan region. First of all, the dichotomy of our city of Nairobi and its environment is that it is one of the fastest growing cities in the world. Number 2, in a recent study done by the Center for Affordable Housing in Africa, Nairobi now has the most expensive land in the continent of Africa. You have about 500,000 people who are moving into the major urban areas every year. And what is the characteristic of the people who you will find in these areas? Number 1, you will probably find the most marginalized person. Those are the dominant people. And that is because the inverse of urbanization is actually taking place in our urban areas. And what do I mean by that? Urbanization tend to connote that there is a high quality of life as you urbanize, but the inverse is actually happening. You find people moving from the rural areas and coming to the urban areas, and they join a growing list of what we call the urban poor. Now, the other, for context purposes, statistic is that we are also one of the most unequal societies, where you have got a very high income disparity. So what happens? Where you have expensive land, and you have got majority of your people are earning very little money. You have the growth of slums, of informal settlements. And that is what characterizes Nairobi and the majority of the major towns in Kenya. And so it's not that there is no planning, there is planning. But you have this huge problem that is evolving so fast that even as you pour resources, even as you come up with a plan after a plan, you just can't keep up. So when we talk about planning in an African city, it is important to understand that that is really the context that you're dealing with. And therefore, where you have got money as a limiting factor, you've got a big challenge in your hands because prioritization becomes a big challenge. And one of the questions that comes up is, do you have a housing problem or you have a transport problem? Now, in our metropolitan in Nairobi, we used to have one of the best public transport systems back in the 70s. In fact, a story is told that the people who put up the Trans-Milano, one of the, I think most of you who are urban planners have gone to study the biggest BRT system in the world. They actually came to Nairobi to study. But nowadays we go to their place to study. And all they did, they came and took our plans and implemented. But we ended up having a public transport system that is driven by private sector, largely. And it's very informal private sector. So we have got what we call matatus. And then the other thing that is happening is that you have a population, and I'm going to use this word loosely, that is somehow addicted to projects. So you're a politician, you come into office. You start talking about planning and you're out in the next 5 years. So you want to come in and the first thing you have to do is to start implementing projects. So what do? You shelve the planners, you get the engineers, they design, and boom, there is black surface. And we think, wow, we are developing. But the truth is, we are not. Why? Because, and I mean, I have a great respect for engineers, please. So don't, if you're an engineer here, don't beat me after this. So what happens is that the engineers are designing roads that are moving cars, but not moving people. The two are very different. So you build a road in an urban area, there is no walkways, there is no cycle lane. But yet 65% of your people, the working population, they walk, right? And because public transport is driven by private sector and it's very informal and it's expensive, so what do people tend to do? And the incomes are low. They, again, all move closer to the inner core, closer to where they work so that they can walk. So I hope I've given you some bit of a context so that when we talk about planning in an African city, and I believe there are many similarities, but not necessarily all of them being the same. Now, let's take a focus on the urban poor, and then I'll tell you how we've tried to solve those issues. The urban poor, as I said, is probably the most marginalized person. And when we define marginalization, because our constitution recognizes marginalization, but I think we didn't go far enough, because when we defined marginalization, we sort of looked at the semi-arid and the arid areas where people didn't get education, there was no infrastructure. And the urban poor was left out from the definition of marginalization. So when it comes to allocating resources for the marginalized, there is very little resource. Actually, there's no money that is allocated towards dealing with the urban poor, and they are the majority. We have now close to 65 to 70% of all our urban population living in a slum. So we have a big problem. So now here is a paradox before I tell you how we've sort of tried to sort it out. In Kenya, the urban areas are the theaters of economic development. That is where the wealth of the country is generated, in the urban areas. So how do you have the theater for economic development, meaning the wealth of the nation is in these urban areas, and 65% of your population is living in slums? That's a paradox. And so I think the elephant in the room, because we have attended so many conferences and we discuss all these issues, the elephant in the room is how can we, the urbanites, the people who believe in the urban agenda, how do we fight for a small share of that wealth to be ring-fenced and reinvested to deal with these issues of urban planning, because we can't depend on loans. We can't tax ourselves out of that issue. So we need to have a financing plan that, first of all, is underpinned by retaining a portion of that wealth so that it can go towards the urban area. Otherwise, most of the time you find it is a footnote. We tried to, in one of the budgets about 3 years ago, to ring fence a certain percentage of our entire budget, and it was kicked out. So we need more voices to deal with that. So how have we dealt with this issue? Now, Nairobi has a day population of 8 million people and a night population of 5.5 million people. So about 3 million people come in daily to work. Where are they coming from? They're coming from the neighboring counties, which are 4. Kiambu, which is one of the largest counties, Murang'a, Machakos, and Kajiado. And those 4 then, you cannot plan for Nairobi and leave this one, because the bedroom of Nairobi is actually in these other counties. Now, in 2013, we devolved our government after the new constitution that came in 2010. So there were resources that were devolved to the second-tier government, which are called counties. And a lot of the urban development and planning functions were actually devolved from the national government. And devolution also means that resources follow functions. But then, because of this unique situation whereby you have devolved money to these subnationals, but there was no structure that brought these 5 counties that are so interrelated together. They don't budget together, they don't plan for their infrastructure together. There was a need to create an authority that brings the 5 counties and come up with what is called a metropolitan agenda. And that is what we did in 2017, and we created an entity called NAMATA, Nairobi Area Metropolitan Transport Authority. What it did is it brought in land use planners, or land use planning and transport planning onto the same conversation. Because often what you find is that the land use planning conversation is happening on that side, and transport planning is happening on the other side, and the two don't talk to each other. And so therefore, you find that where you're planning your housing is not necessarily where you're planning for your transport nodes, and there is a complete misalignment. I am winding up. So what does this structure of NAMATA entail? It brought in the 5 governors of the 5 counties, and then they had to roll back some of the functions that had been devolved to be in this metropolitan structure. And that is a very difficult thing to do, because everybody loves resources. So you have a budget and then you have to give it back. And these are big budgets for roads and transport and so on and so forth. Then we have the cabinet secretary for transport, they formed a council and becomes the chair of the council. And then the governor for Nairobi is a deputy chair. And then you have a board where each and every ministers of urban planning and housing in the 5 counties sit in the board, plus 3 independents. And I want to say that was the hardest work to do, was to establish this organization. Now we have NAMATA, it is working, and we really want to take this opportunity to thank the World Bank, because they worked with us to set it up. Now we have the MCC that has come to the table now, and they are assisting us to finance for green BRT buses, but also assisting us to do transit-oriented development. So we believe that this is part of the answer to ensuring that a majority of our people, we are densifying along the transit corridors, providing sustainable public and affordable public transport systems. So I think I've said a mouthful. I still have 2 minutes left, but I'm not going to really exhaust them, but I just have one last point that I wanted to say in that. The issue of climate change, wherever it is happening, the people who bear the biggest blood are the urban poor. They have no resilience. When there is a disaster, a small fire that ordinarily you will contain, first of all, cannot be contained because there are no access roads. So fire engines cannot come in. When you have, a pandemic like COVID comes in, there is no resilience. So there is really a need for all of us to come together and really focus on this issue of the urban poor. And I give you back some few minutes. Thank you.
Very much. And we'll move right away to Mohammed Damba.
Thank you. I would look at the regime of planning legislation. Yeah, thank you. In Africa, focusing on Ghana and how that relates to the institutional arrangements we have for implementation of programs and projects for urban development. And I'll conclude with 2-point lessons. First of all, Ghana in particular has a long history of urban planning, in the beginning with the early parts of the 20th century. I guess in the sub-Saharan Africa, we were one of the first. And so we have learned a lot, except that the laws we work with were bequeathed from our colonial governments that were pretty much same laws with names of countries changed and distributed along the colonial corridors of Gambia, Ghana, Nigeria, and so on and so forth. So we had a chapter series. Ghana had Chapter 84, popularly known as CAP 84. Over time, our aspirations changed, our governance structures changed, and we embarked on a decentralization program. That meant that we devolved power down, allow people in the local government areas to determine their future, their development, what their priorities were. With this, we still had this law, which is essentially a centralized law, overseeing or moderating local government activities. So you had a law that required that if anybody required a permit, like Mayor said, you come to Accra, the capital, from wherever you were, because the country then was small, just about 6 million people, by our first census in the 60s. And so at a point we were openly in defiance of our own law because things just didn't work, because there's no way people across the country could be traveling to the national capital for simple urban planning or development control functions like seeking permits. This led us to a project it was a World Bank funded project known as the Land Administration Project that the Town and Country Planning Department then was involved in. And one of the key reform activities we undertook was to reform the legal and institutional processes that we had. And so we wrote a new law. And this new law sought to introduce a lot of things. First of all, we have sought to legislate the visioning process for planning for our cities, because we observed that subdivision plans were simply just being prepared to make way for people to develop without the framework of any vision. And we all know any city developing without a vision just ends up making the planning process a futile one. And so that has been legislated, where you now have city authorities having to prepare what we call spatial development frameworks, simply embodying the aspirations of the city, on the basis of which other lower level plans, such as structure plans and local plans, as we call them, I guess here you call them subdivision plans, are prepared. So you now have a chain of conformity from what a parcel of land is used for, linked to the wider city, and also linked to the entire territorial area of the local government. We have also legislated matters related to participatory planning, because we had a few experts sitting somewhere and determining how the future, the city spaces look like. It is now almost a crime to do that. We have introduced transparency measures that require that plans are publicized widely in various newspapers and platforms, websites, so that we do not have only a few people knowing what is supposed to be going on in the cities. We also have made provision for what we call public data rooms, where information about permits, plans, decisions of various committees at the local government levels are deposited for anybody who wants to verify at any point in time to go check. So if you see any development going on that you think it's not in conformity with the plan for the city, you can simply walk in there and check to see what's going on. More importantly is the creation of appellate procedures that allow people to lodge complaints, to seek reviews if the decisions taken by the local governments are not in their favor in particular, so that we can have a more open and democratic process of grievance redress. Now, the big lesson out of all of this is the way we manage development administration in our cities. We do have a situation where the local governments do not have the legal authority and the capacity, I must say, to arrange for large-scale funding to undertake some of the projects that they need to transform lives. And so what is happening is that we have the central government, through the Ministry of Finance and related institutions, handling the arrangement of finance, sometimes working with the local authorities to shape projects and programs, even though we do understand that the job of the central government is to focus on matters of policy, focus on matters of preparing guidelines, standards to guide operations at the local government level. But we still have a big challenge with capacity. All the experts that understand the job want to be at the center, at the top. They do not want to go to the local government areas because we do not have enough incentives, I must say, to keep the expertise that is required to develop the local government areas. Now, so what we're doing, of course, with the help of the World Bank and other partners, is to evolve special purpose structures for project management. So when we have, for example, we're currently running a project in Accra known as the GARID project, Greater Accra Resilient and Integrated Development Project, which followed some floods in 2015 that killed about 100 people, affected about 85,000 people. And that particularly happened along a channel known as the Odo Channel, along which about 2.5 million people live. And so the decision of government was to work with the bank to arrange for some $200 million to undertake a number of interventions to improve the situation and make sure that we do not have a repeat of such floods and the disasters that they brought about. Like I said, we are clear that the local governments on their own cannot handle the scale of projects. Neither is it the business of the central government to go about handling operational matters at the local government level. So what we're doing is to establish what we call project steering committees that involve representatives from both the central government and the local government areas to work together on various aspects of project management the engineering aspects, planning aspects, finance, monitoring, evaluation, project communication, grievance redress, and so on and so forth. And that seems to be working very well, even though there's a tendency for some of the public officials to want to keep things to themselves and not share. What I mean is that some of the officers think the funds were arranged from the top, and so they have to be in charge. But we all also understand that whatever activity that is involved is happening in the local government area, and so it has to go there. But like I told you, because the capacities are quite low, government is skeptical to leave all this responsibility onto them. So in conclusion, what I'll say is that the model we are applying now is working for us, and we intend to continue with it, which is to say that whenever there is a program to carry out a massive development intervention, it does not become a matter of strict mandate. That is to say, the local government area is strictly in charge, and so they have to be in charge of the central government. We constitute special purpose vehicles or entities that work with all facets of experts to deliver. And once the delivery is done, the sustainability arrangements are left with the local governments, and then the central government operatives go back to their seats. Where I work in particular requires that central government continues to get involved, because in, for example, road projects, you find local government authorities, some of them, failing to go by the standards. So if you're working with a right-of-way of a particular size, you get to another local area, and then they tell you by resolution, we have agreed to reduce this to a particular size. And we all know once you have varying right-of-ways, it becomes difficult for engineering works to be viable. And so we insist from the top that such standards are followed and that nobody deviates. And I think from our various countries, the land belongs to us, the people are people. We have a responsibility to develop them. And so the biggest lesson is that when it comes to development, it's not about I am in charge of the local government level, or I'm in charge of central government level. It's about how do we go about delivering the development that the people need. And so whichever model that works for any country, I think it's up to them to think about it and work that way, whilst we keep our boundaries at the same time, because the mandates are clear by law. Thank you very much.
I think we'll move ahead to our respondents. We're actually back on track with our time now. Thank you all. Professor Glazer.
Thank you, and it's a distinct honor to be part of this remarkable panel with these three fantastic public servants, and Saleh, from whom I've learned a great deal over many years. I want to start with an observation about economics and urban planning, that at the heart of urban planning, there is an urge to determine what goes where within the city. And that urge runs deeply counter to the most profound instincts of urban economists, which are to say, no, you should not try to decide what goes where in the city. You should let the market fundamentally make it work. Which is not to say that I don't agree with Don that there are market failures everywhere. There are market failures everywhere. But we are so far from actually knowing what exactly we should be doing in response to those that I think that it's wise for us to at least start with the instinct that we're not going to try and micromanage what things go in what places of the city. Now, I will highlight one quick exception and then one major exception. The quick exception is just as important as the major exception, but I'm not going to say very much about it, which is obviously if you're going to have a bus rapid transit system, if you're going to have urban assets of all different forms, they need to go somewhere in space. And I think it's fantastic that we have Steve Redding, who has done such an incredibly important job at pushing the economics of transportation in a spatial context forward. Nick Sivanides, who is part of our RGC team, is also part of that. And you could extend that to broader public assets. For example, the trees that Mayor Aki Sawyer emphasized, they need to go somewhere in space. If we're going to put in roofs that are going to protect people from heat, those are going to have to go somewhere in space. And so thinking somewhat around that is important. Now, The thing that this leads me to is the longer point that I want to make, which is about the interaction between planning, at least of things like trees and no-build zones and transportation, and climate change. I want to take the next 3 minutes that I have to basically re-emphasize that dealing with climate change is, in fact, the largest unsolved problem of the 21st century for developing world cities. And you heard that made its way through all three presentations, right? This is about adaptation, not mitigation. Mitigation is a hard problem, right? But it's a problem in which the economics tend to be fairly clear, right? We just need to do less in terms of fossil fuels. And it's also a problem in which most of the action should be happening in the wealthy world, not in the poor world, right? We created this problem, right? Those of us in the wealthy world, it's our moral responsibility to do it. It's not our responsibility to tell poor world cities that they can't develop because we need them to cut back on their carbon emissions. But adaptation is real, and you saw it so palpably in Cockle Bay, right? Those images that Mayor Aki-Sawyer showed us was just, that's an environmental disaster waiting to happen, which, climate change is only going to make this worse. Now, some form of adaptation require money, not management of ordinary citizens. Painting things white, putting out those trees, building massive seawalls, something that assuredly we're going to be doing a great deal of in the wealthy world, much less likely to see tens of billions of dollars going on in terms of the poor world and seawalls. But they don't require citizen buy-in for anything more than writing a check. But many other actions involve stopping informal settlements in highly dangerous areas, either because there's an externality from the poor settlements, meaning that they're going to do something that's going to create flooding in some other area or going to create a land collapse, or just because we're willing to engage in paternalistic actions that say we just don't want to let people kill themselves by moving into flood zones, right? And I'm actually okay with either of those justifications for being involved. Now, implicit in Mayor Aki-Sawyer's presentation was suggesting that there might be a Gresham's law for developing world cities and their housing, right? If you build enough good housing, maybe that will drive the bad housing out of the market. And certainly on some very extreme level that is possible, but it's an empirical claim, and it's one which, given the enormous eagerness of people to move to developing world cities, I'm not sure it's going to hold out. So this does not in any sense mean that we shouldn't be trying to make our urban spaces as good as they can. And I'm 100% behind Mayor Aki-Sawyer's vision, but I don't think that eliminates the need to think about the Cockle Bays of this world and whether or not we want to do something that takes actions to that. There also is embedded an empirical question here for the researchers here that, is it true? How much of building good housing does it slow down the growth of informal settlements? But thinking about how we're going to, do something that limits the growth of those areas, that's really hard. It's really hard because saying no to your citizens is really hard, and it's really hard because the fundamental truth of urban government everywhere in the world is capacity is far more important than policy, right? It is useless for most of us to come to developing world cities and say, we have a clever idea for you to implement, unless we have a clear way that they're going to implement it. Because they're all drinking from a fire hose, dealing with conflicts constantly, dealing with challenges constantly, and coming up with some way to implement some clever idea you've come up with is rarely going to make things better. Now, one part of that, and this was raised in the presentations as well, we're talking about funding, whether or not it's the balance between national funding and local funding, or just getting compliance from the taxpayers in your local areas. That is a major agenda going forward. I particularly want to call out the work of Augustin Bergeron on tax collection in the Democratic Republic of the Congo. But figuring out how to make tax collecting more effective is a huge issue. And being clever about the technology may not be as important as figuring out how to put systems in place in which we actually induce people to pay. Finally, I will end by saying compliance and capacity are just a larger element of getting our governments to be better. And that's in some sense why I'm so honored. These are three leaders who are actually in the business of making their governments more effective. Cities and government are strong complements because cities are full of externalities and they actually need governments to be effective. And that's why we have evidence of urban regulations going back thousands of years to the Code of Hammurabi, which are about dealing with the externalities that come from people living next to each other in cities. Which is why if we're going to deal with climate change, if we're going to deal with the ability of cities to create upward mobility, we really have to start at making the governments of developing world cities more effective and being seen as more effective so they're not just good at getting things done, but they're trusted by their citizens to get things done and to get things done in a way that is fair for all of them. Thank you.
Thank you. Sally, over to you.
Thank you, Ed. These presentations are a difficult act to follow for me, but I want to point out to everybody here that what we're seeing here is something that I've been waiting to happen for a long time, and that is almost like new paradigms for working in African cities that are managed, created, and implemented by African planners and African thinkers, instead of borrowing stuff from the North or the colonial laws that you were talking about before, but kind of thinking for yourself. And I think that that is at the core here, and I think that to second what Ed was saying, that we would like to see this capacity increase. We would like to see more, less people coming from the global North spending time and taking back keeping the funds in the global North, and more things happening in the global South. I want to point out at the beginning that I really like the idea that this is a conference on urban expansion and the future of cities. This has been a long time coming. I mean, I looked up on Google Scholar about the use of the term sprawl as against the use of the term urban expansion. And between 2005 and 2019, the use of the word urban expansion has increased quite substantially, and the use of the word sprawl has decreased. Namely, we're looking at this in a positive way in terms of what we can do about it, rather than kind of complaining that cities are growing in improper ways. I think that one of the things that really concerns me is what Charles was saying about urban expansion, that things are going too fast. Things are going too fast, and even though you have planning, it's not catching up. And I think that a lot of the things that the mayor was talking about are things that has to do with her own city and what it is right now. And I'm kind of trying to think about the 600,000 people that are going to be coming to the city. And there's very little that you need to do about that, but that's not being done. So the kind of things that I would like to see happening is small things, but things that actually prepare the city to absorb all of the people that are going to be coming. And we know that Sub-Saharan Africa is the fastest growing cities in the world, and between now and 2050, 1/3 of all the growth in population is going to be in Sub-Saharan Africa. So you need to make some preparations. Now, I just wanted to point out to you that just having the laws is not going to be of great help. I mean, I've worked in Colombia where there's literally 1,100 pages of urban law, and you still have informality and informal settlements, and nothing is happening on the urban periphery. So again, I couldn't, I'm very happy with the development that are happening, and with the idea of what Mohammed was talking about, these kind of pragmatic models about how to get things done with what we have. Because we can't wait. Anytime that we say, look, if only we could make these changes that we can't make, we could solve these problems. We can't make these changes. We have to do with what we've got. And I think that all of you have shown that this is indeed possible. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, we're going to spend about 10 minutes with a moderated conversation here before opening up to Q&A. I was really struck in each of our panelists' presentations. I mean, all three of you articulated the great challenge of trying to bring order, bring planning to processes that there should be a plan, but life goes otherwise. So there's a difference between the theory, what you'd like to see, and the practice. Can each of you speak a little bit about what you see as the biggest hurdle, the biggest barrier to getting plans implemented, getting plans on the table and getting them implemented? First to you, Mayor Aki Sayar.
Well, I mean, clearly our biggest challenge is that we're not allowed to make the plans. So, you know, we have, as I mentioned, done area action plans for 5 informal settlements. And just to the point that Edward made, just to clarify something, perhaps if I may, we're really conscious of the fact that we cannot bring improved housing, that notion of you relocate people from informal settlements into formal areas, that's not something that we are even thinking about.
Sorry, I was suggesting that by having better space, you would have less growth of informal settlement. Not that
okay.
you were relocating it at all, but
Okay.
the hope was that by having really nice space to move in, you wouldn't move into the Cockle Bay. Not that you would be moving anyone out of Cockle Bay into those areas.
Yes, but the challenge is, as Charles said, the people who are moving into the city couldn't afford to build in those nice houses. So there's still the likelihood is they're still going to move into areas where there's no land tenure, where there is that informality. We have 40% of our population living in informality, but what we are seeking to do is to upgrade. So the informal settlement, the Slum Dwellers Association have a slogan: upgrade where possible, relocate where necessary. And that relocate where necessary is when people's lives are really in danger. So for example, in Cockle Bay, we've worked with the community there over a number of years to do geotech studies of the soil. So we know on maps where it is really, really unsafe, and that's the red zone. We have the yellow zone where some housing can be bought, some settlement can be done safely, and then the green zone, which is obviously closer to the land or at the land, which is safe. And with the community, we've been able to identify, their choice of improved housing structure, bringing in drainage, solar lighting, sanitation. This is upgrading, bringing in, effectively improving the quality of what's there. And as they say, instead of taking the people out of the slum, you take the slum out of the people. So we've got 5 communities that we're working on there. And the challenge is scale. As others have said, ceteris paribus doesn't exist in reality. Nothing is staying equal. People are moving every day, and your problem is getting bigger even as you're seeking to solve it. But we keep going. We have to, and we keep on looking at solutions which have the people at the heart, because that's the biggest hope of effective execution.
Charles, what would you say is your biggest barrier to trying to get the plans in place? What are your barriers?
I will look at it largely from, we have put together urban governance and urban institution. Like I mentioned, we have this authority called NEMATA as an example. But planning is extremely difficult sell to make to our people. As I said, majority of our people wants to see a road, want to see an infrastructure, and that will guarantee you another term. And a lot of that infrastructure that is happening in most of our, let me give you an example. We have 3 road agencies in Kenya, one dealing with highways, one dealing with urban roads, and the other one dealing with rural roads. This urban road agency, I'm the one in charge of the urban areas from a policy perspective, but they make roads with zero reference to sort of the custodian of the urban areas. So the kind of road designs that they will put up have no, as I said, they will have no bus stops, no street furniture, and that's not an urban road, but there is some piece of infrastructure. The other thing that I see, which is the biggest hurdle, especially for our devolved governments, is the politicization of the urban planning. To sort of be effective and compliance is very difficult to implement, because let me give you an example. We've invested a lot of money. Majority of our people are traders and informal traders. So you will put a walkway, but they will convert the walkway into a sales area. Now, then what happens is that you still push the pedestrian back to a conflict with the vehicles. And there is no enforcement. And if you try and move the traders from trading on the walkways, it becomes a political problem. And one of the solutions, for example, to that is where you depoliticize. In other words, and we're encouraging our mayor. We don't have mayors in Kenya. We have municipal boards and the county governments to say, look, let's give you protection on the enforcement as national government, because if you're going to look at enforcement from a political perspective, you will not make no decision. So we're building markets where we want the traders to move from trading from the roads, but they don't go into these markets that we have built. Why? Because the footfall is on the road, you don't want. If you try and force them, then your local, what we call the member of county assembly, say, those are my voters, leave them on the road. So there is an element of trying to look at how do you depoliticize urban planning. And I think an authority like Namata, which has you're sort of not limited to a political term, and that it's empowered, it has a bit of a bite, will be one of the solutions. But I can speak on and on, but I think that will be how we'll contextualize it.
And Mohammed Damba, you spoke about the need in some cases to actually legislate the requirement for plans.
Yes, what we have in Ghana, we have failed spectacularly in that front, where we thought that ensuring compliance with the plans can happen if you pass laws and prescribing punishments and jail terms and fines, and it's simply not worked so far. Why? Because we have observed that public officials do not recognize that nurturing plans and seeing them through implementation, through compliance from the citizens, require good customer service. You treat them like your customers, help them. If you do not, they would always find ways to escape the traps you have set through laws. And in Ghana, we do have traditional authorities that are as powerful as the state. And 80% of the land is in customary holding, which means it's outside of government's control. So if you have 80% of your land under the control of people who you cannot ordinarily take to the courts, let alone jail them, then it becomes difficult to go through the route of using principally the legal means to ensure that people comply with the plans. And so it doesn't look like if we continue to go this path, things are going to change. And so when I used to work with the Ghana Institute of Planners, we started working at this as a matter of ethics to ensure that if you're a professional planner, then you have a responsibility first to serve the people. So at the end of the year, in measuring whether you are in good standing or not, in addition to your subscriptions, we interview people to see how much of your hand you have extended to the public. And it is the public that will let us know whether you have given them good service or not, and on the basis of which your certificate is renewed. I think we need to employ more innovative ways of getting our people to understand us, that we are all in the boat together. And so the more they comply, the better they become. And collectively, we all grow and become better. And so this is my learning so far. Thank you.
Thank you. So I think we'll move to the Q&A portion now. I'm going to ask Professor Glazer to take over the moderation. I've had a scheduling issue, so I have to return to the Elliott School. We've got about 15 minutes left now for the open Q&A. Thanks for the great panel presentations, the keynotes. This is a fascinating conversation, and I'm sorry to have to leave just in the last few minutes.
Thank you. So I'd like it if we could have 3 or 4 questions taken at the same time, if people could come up. But I want to start myself by asking Mayor Akiso about enforcement of red zones. So Mr. Hinga said a situation that I think is pretty darn common, where you have a bunch of guys, they found some convenient public space, they want to hang out, and it is murder to try and get them to move away from this. Whereas you seem to describe a situation in which there was a red zone, it was dangerous, and everyone got off, and we didn't have more people undertake it. Does it actually work? Are you able to work that magic so magnificently in Freetown?
Did you hear me say anybody got off?
Okay. So if you're designated, it's less clear with it.
No, it's a journey. Okay, so this is in a community, and what we've done is agree with them. But I'll give you another example. Agree with them that when we have the funding, because in order for them to move off, we need to provide alternative housing. So there's an agreement that they will move when the funding is available to do the housing. But let me give you another example, because I said that we're working in 5 informal settlements. There's a very famous informal settlement called Crew Bay. And as others have said, one of the challenges with informal settlements is always almost, that they have no access roads. So when you talk about the fire, devastation. A school's being built in Crew Bay at the moment, and the quid pro quo with the community is that you're getting a wonderful investment, but the philanthropist who is partnering with the city to build it has said they will stop the construction unless there's an access road. That means residents need to agree to have their properties taken down. I sat in a meeting with residents, and it was heartwarming to have one after the other put their hand up and say, I wasn't going to agree, but I'm agreeing now. And we are literally going to have the access road created with the collaboration of the residents. The point about, and I really wanted to make this point, plans versus politics. It's so easy for the technocrats and the planners to put all the blame on the politicians. I refuse and reject that. It is not a given that politicians are on the side of saying, oh, no, I need my votes. No. It's a question of communication. And whether you bring the traditional rulers on board, whether you work with the planners, we have many examples of, we don't have effective planners, but we have many examples of the road authority being the ones who are encouraging people to work and trade along the right of way. This is a collective challenge, and it's too easy to throw it at the politicians. There are options for success. Crew Bay is one. We will get success with Coco Bay when we get the funding. World Bank, anybody listening? There is a funding challenge here. And I'll just close by saying that the involvement of street traders, nothing for me without me, is a term which is often used by the slum community dwellers, or the informal settlement dwellers. We are actually, as we speak, implementing a no trading zone on 23 streets. But we've done it by engaging the traders themselves and having them police it. So I'm not saying we have a magic bullet, but I am saying that involvement of communities and engagement can get you to move further than if you're standing back and just, expecting them to follow laws.
Well, in a sense, that model is getting... and as I said, we're going to take 3 or 4 in a row. Go ahead, please.
Hi, this has been a fantastic panel. I'm Alicia Cooperman, Assistant Professor in Political Science and International Affairs at GW down the road. And on this exact point about how we're engaging with communities, slum organizations, neighborhood organizations, tenant associations, trader associations, I was wondering if you could speak to variation across those associations and their capacity to advocate for their residents or their participants. Something I've seen in my research in Brazil is that certain associations are much more effective, much more organized than others, and so then they're able to engage more with local politicians or development projects, but then those communities or those trader groups that are less organized then are unable to be part of that process, and that can further the inequality. So I was wondering if you've seen those examples and if you can speak to challenges or opportunities there. Thank you.
Wonderful, thank you. Next, please. And we're going to take all 4 of these questions, and then we're going to go down the line, starting with Saleh, to respond to any parts of them you want to. Yes.
Hi, I'm Monica Bansal with USAID. I know this is a session about planning, but I'm struck by how much of the root issue here for a lot of what you're talking about is poverty. And how local governments are really being asked to deal with, national issues of poverty with what seem like pretty insufficient tools, planning tools to do so. So my question is on, whether we should be considering broader policy tools like social safety nets, things like this, where there's more of a partnership between local governments and national governments. Thanks.
Thank you. And certainly poverty is a running theme, but it's also true that merchants steal common space in Rome, too. I mean, it's not like this doesn't happen everywhere. Yes, please.
Thank you. My name is Rebecca Ochong from Habitat for Humanity International. My question is regarding the issue around informal settlements. I think we've talked about it quite a bit today from all the panelists. And one of the things I think which really struck me was a comment from Mr. Hinga regarding where funding is going. I think the informal settlements, I think it's a big issue. Urbanization, that's where we are seeing more and more people in urban areas. And yet, when we look at development assistance generally, I think that goes more to the rural areas. What are some of the challenges that you're seeing, and what are you doing from your end to try and kind of highlight some of these issues to ensure that more resources go to address some of these urgent challenges? Thank you.
Wonderful, thank you. And in back of you, and then we'll go. Yep.
Hi, I'm Paula from NYU Center on International Cooperation, and I wanted to ask a question about inequality, especially Mr. Hinga's point about distributing the wealth and getting some of that wealth to benefit everyone. So what are some examples of policies that can be used to tackle urban inequality? So the example of property tax, I feel like is a good one, but are there other examples of measures that can be taken that goes beyond the assumption that wealth is just going to trickle down to the most vulnerable? Thank you.
Wonderful, please.
Kala Sridhar from ISEC, from the Institute for Social and Economic Change in Bangalore. I'm quite amazed that the city of Freetown is trying to plan, but with no access to urban planning tools. See, this is a slightly different story in Indian cities, where most cities have planning in place, tools in place, and also master plans. But more than 90% of the city represents violations, right? So is there any point in planning at all? And I could not agree more with Professor Gleiser that these cities are really hard-pressed for capacity. So I want to be a little bit more provocative and ask whether our cities should refrain from planning, because market-based cities are the best places for ideas to generate, and you cannot expect innovation in forced concentration camps, right? Only in good cities, free cities, that we can expect all these ideas and productivity. Thanks.
Wonderful, thanks. Last question.
Thank you. Sorry to pile on. Dmitry Sivayev, an urban specialist here at the bank. Really fascinating and inspiring discussion. And it relates a lot to my work, because I've been working in Central Asia and currently in Central America. In all these places, I worked on issues of local economic development, housing, service provision. A lot of it comes down to planning and insufficient planning. But what I wanted to ask is that, I've looked at what we know and what advice we give to our clients, people like you, on planning, and it's all the same thing. Like, you need to have national systems in place, and you need to have capacity. None of those cut the mustard. National systems outside of your remit, and if you wait for national systems to be developed, city, you don't have time to waste. You need to act now. And then capacity building is just the most abstract thing. Like, hire more planners, hire more people who check if what's being built aligned with the plan. So question is, what's your advice for us? Where do we start? Where do you think help on our hand could be most useful? Is it about technical specifics of regulations and that need to be enforced most efficiently? What are the most efficient regulations? Or are there specific capacities that we can support and help bring? Maybe related to data and building data systems to inform decisions. So just looking for some guidance from you to help our work be more relevant. Thank you.
Great. So we're going to go down starting with Sally, and I want you to try to respond to whatever you want, but try to keep it to about 2 minutes, okay? Sally, you're up first.
Thank you. I would like to respond to 3 questions or challenges here. The challenge of informal settlements, the challenge of compliance, which is related because informal settlements by definition are not in compliance. The mentioning of Muhammad of 80% of the land on the periphery of cities is customary land, and the issue just raised about capacity building. The thing that I want to suggest to this audience as a research question is, how come we still have informal settlements? We've been dealing with this for decades, and it's still happening in the same way that it has happened before. So it must be that we're not doing something right, and what I want to bring up is this idea, and I think Charles talked about it, the mayor talked about participation, but a different kind of participation. What I think needs to happen is for us to understand who is creating these informal settlements, and how can we intervene in the process of creating those informal settlements so that they become, instead of informal settlements, they become housing subdivisions. And the difference is not that great when you think about it. The main difference is just layout. Because once we have the layout, we have the access road that you were talking about in advance. And I'll talk about this more in the afternoon, but Abico and his colleagues were studying favelas in Brazil are saying it costs 3 to 6 times more to put a road or to put the services in an existing settlement than to have that thing laid out before it is occupied. So we need to engage these customary chiefs. And that's where we need the capacity. We need to teach them and the rural people how to do land subdivision. And this is where I think I want to encourage capacity building. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you, and wonderfully on time. Over to you, Mohammed.
Well, okay, sorry. What did he?
So did he?
No, it's your turn.
Okay, that's fine.
Okay, whatever you want to
Yes, it's a big dilemma whether we should go on planning or we should sit back and observe the people and help them shape the spaces that they want. I think I'm leaning towards the second thought. It's radical for a planner to speak this way, but if you look at our situation, it does look, I have been part of a number of special planning programs where we have laid out things clearly, but even just fitting into those spaces and subdivisions become a challenge because of, not because they do not want to comply, but they have been compelled by circumstances, economic circumstances, sometimes social, cultural circumstances, that makes it difficult to fit the perceived good plan that we have for them. And that is why we have all over the world, start talking about participatory planning with the hope that once you involve the people, then you co-create the spaces that you want. That also has been going on in various countries, and I still see variations from the path of compliance to some extent. So where the gap is where I'm struggling to understand now. But let me say something that we do know. There's an HR issue, human resource management, and ethical issue, sometimes with some of the practices of our officers in our parts of the world. Corruption, we have to talk about it. where an officer misbehaves and they are simply moved from one local government area to another, and that's the punishment they have. It's not helping. And so a lot of them do have the capacity, but they simply sometimes are failing to do the right thing. And that is a challenge, Mayor, we have to deal with in whichever way we can. Yes, thank you.
Charles, thank you. Let me first of all say that it's easy to say that to solve all these informal settlement issues, you need more money, and that is true. But as I said, money is a limiting factor. However, there are simple things that should be done and not being done. And I'll give you some example, one or two examples, where I think that we have somehow glorified mediocrity, or maybe mediocrity has become the norm. Because, for example, if you come to Nairobi, Kenya, for example, we have the ratio of policeman to citizen is not the greatest. But we've deployed lots of policemen to man our traffic lights. And the traffic lights are working. So, surely that is not a money issue. So you find that because for the longest time people have been accustomed to doing the wrong thing, when you come to the traffic light and it is red, if you stop, people are hooting at you, like, dude, move. If you build a dedicated bus lane, they won't observe it. So it's not about more laws, because I think we have enough. It's not about, but you need some simple things of, can we just comply? If you focus on compliance, there's a lot of issues that you start sorting out. The issues of traffic jam and then so on and so forth, you sort them out. And again, to Mayor, so I was not throwing the issue to the politician, but therein lies the problem, because for you to go and get traders, and there are many of them in Kenya, the formally employed are about 3.5 million. The informally employed are about 18 million. So if you want to get reelected, you're going to come up with some populist ideas, and compliance becomes a bit of a problem. Now, just loosely, because this is a whole, I don't want to throw us into a tailspin, because this is a whole new topic that I believe we should be discussing. We spend a lot of money. Kenya, for example, we have a 3 trillion shilling budget. We're spending 650 billion Kenya shillings on educating our young people. And we believe that education is the greatest equalizer. What we don't do is we are not spending time to create jobs. So you're spending a lot of money to educate these young people, but not creating jobs. And I think when you start looking at the conversation around housing, because there is huge housing deficit, but you need to unpack and look at the economics of housing. And you realize that focusing on housing is not only the right thing to do, but you're going to solve a very big issue of sustainable job creation. You deal with planning, because you've grown in an unplanned way for many years. So how much more can you undo what has taken 60 years? I don't know, there is no magic wand somewhere where you will wave and then things will be like here in DC. No, you have to start looking at new nodes. You've got to start looking at how do you create economic zones and repurpose and replan your city. So, so I think this is into an answer to one of the people. So I think I'm going to leave it there, because I wish we can talk about the economics of housing and why we need to focus on it, because we kill many birds with one stone. Thank you.
Okay, so many things have been raised, but I want to start with perhaps the question from India of, do we just give up on planning? And this is from somebody who has not had the opportunity to do any planning. But what I do feel is that, I hear, Mohammed, I hear the concerns, I hear your concerns. Building permit issuance in and of itself would be so useful, indisputably. Why? Because even if you're not talking about, granular or even a high-level spatial plan, when you have a situation where people are building in waterways and blocking rivers and leading to flooding their own communities, when you have a situation where people are building on mangrove, where you're actually now having whole residential areas on what was your biodiversity, you need some mechanism to be able to control, if not the entirety of a design, but to actually act as a control to protect the environment, to protect lives, to build resilience, to actually enable service delivery. One of our biggest challenges in the city, most cities, is sanitation. When you are able to have an entire community built on a steep mountainside, where in the event of a landslide, I've been up to communities where when there's a landslide, you can't even go with a tricycle. You are literally walking single file. There needs to be some way to protect life. And for me, let's bring the planning down to the lowest denominator of use. And I would say there has to be some way for building permits to be restricted or given as part of this wider environment. There was a talk about jobs, housing, and how do we, people keep coming. No one has said anything about the need for there to be more equality in terms of investments outside of the city. This is something which, as a mayor, I often raise. We need to be investing not just in the urban areas, but outside of the urban areas. There needs to be incentive for people to want to stay home, to want to stay within their communities. And that's where in the earlier session, we talked about the interaction between, small cities, big cities, but also between rural areas. Poverty funding for the rural communities versus urbanized areas. This is one of the reasons why when we're doing Transform Freetown, we really have a process of co-creation. We're sitting down with those who are mandated and feel that it is their responsibility. Thank you, we thank them for that, to come and make interventions, investments, but don't do it sitting in your office. Do it sitting with those who are at the forefront. And through that process, we've been able to get organizations who previously only looked at rural areas to understand the importance of investing in the urban poor and in terms of addressing that, not keeping them as the urban poor. Variations in community groups, Traders Council versus Slum Dwellers Association, etc. That definitely exists. But I think what's perhaps as important is where you're coming from as a city leadership. If your attitude is that you understand and acknowledge that no matter the strength of the organization in front of you, what you want to get to is making sure you're engaging those who are represented, then it's your responsibility not to deal with them just on the basis of their strength, but to ensure that you get beyond that and you get to what the needs of those communities are and having them as part of your conversation. And I'll close on this. We also have about 60% of our residents who are informal traders. And this question of how do you ensure that you are improving the lives of your residents? I think maybe the approach that we take is to not look at this as a silo, but to look at the lives of your residents, the quality of the lives of your residents, so whether they're traders, living in informal settlements, women who have children who need childcare, don't have access to water, don't have access to health. Your concern is your resident. When your concern is your resident, you begin to look at these things not as I just have to make sure there's nobody on the street, but if I'm moving you from the street and you say you're building markets, good luck. If you just build the markets, you can have the markets and they're going to be empty. We have that situation. What if we realized, somebody talked about the footfall. If I know that I'm selling fish and I'm in the market and somebody else is selling fish and she's on the street, the customer is going to come to the one selling the fish on the street because the customer is also lazy and doesn't want to park their car somewhere and walk to the market. So what are we looking to do now? We're going to experiment with this and see how it goes. Everybody's selling fish. The market can't take everybody. But if everybody's selling fish is in the market, when you want fish, you go to the market. So begin to categorize and segment so that there are incentives. But you have to treat your residents not as numbers, not as non-compliant, not even just as voters, but as individuals whose lives you want to improve.
Thank you, Mayor. I think it's nice to end on this note of reminding us that real cities are made up of flesh and blood. They are breathing, live entities. They're not made of concrete or blacktop. There are two major themes of this conference, and it's been 10 years since it has been founded. This is the eighth conference, one of which is the dialogue between policymakers and scholars. And we have certainly learned a great deal from our policymakers here this morning. I hope all of you who are in the scholarship business think about what you've learned about what you can do that will have the most value, right? Lots of issues about how we generate public capacity, lots of issues about how we deal with the allocation of space, right? These are important and hard issues. Lots of questions about whether or not, how big the scope of government should be. Lots of interesting questions about federalism. What happens when you have when you have local governments and national governments that don't agree with one another, right? And how do we resolve those? We're going to have, in the keynote speech, you're going to have an opportunity to have the dialogue go the other way when Gilles Dranton is going to tell us about his remarkable work on infrastructure, particularly urban infrastructure. But the second theme of this 10-year event, of course, is that cities matter. That in fact, in the developing world, cities have often faced biases. They face biases at the country level, where, for example, in India, rural voters are often represented by huge swings relative to urban voters, and funds flow disproportionately to where there are voters. Cities are biased against in the development economics community historically, which is often focused on getting farms to be better. And truth be told, and luckily this is a long time in the past, it has even been an anti-urban bias within the World Bank historically, which has often seen its job being about rural development much more than cities. And I think I want to particularly thank both these amazing policymakers in Saleh, but also the organizers of the conference who have done such a great job of championing urbanization and urban space within both the research space and the policy-related space of the World Bank. So please join me in giving them and our panel a hand. And now it's time for lunch.